There you go.
Now I am. Apologies. I'm sorry. Lynn Carpenter here from the Churchill School and Center and the Reading League New York State chapter. Thrilled to welcome Dr. Timothy Shanahan today. So the Churchill School and Center is a school for students with language-based learning disabilities in New York City. We provide professional development and engagement and professional development workshops, etc. We offer parent programming and workshops on topics like building literacy skills and executive functioning, ADHD. I also want to mention that we have a free after-school Orton Gillingham-based tutoring program here at Churchill. I know there's a lot of people from outside New York City today. We have remote options. If you know a child who might qualify or be interested, I'm happy to share some more information. We're also the Reading League New York, and our mission for the Reading League is to advance the awareness, understanding, and use of evidence-aligned reading instruction throughout the state of New York, and also to be able to provide sessions like this for everyone to attend outside of New York as well. If you'd like more information, you can visit us on social media. And I just want to highlight 2 upcoming events we have here. We're going to host Lynn Stone on October 21st in person on this Uncovering the Simplicity of Spelling, the Simplicity and Science of Spelling in grades 3 through 6. And also we are going to have a multi-chapter book study for Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen's book, Literacy Foundations for English Learners. I am now thrilled to introduce Dr. Shanahan. He is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was founding director of the UIC Center for Literacy. Previously, he was director of reading for the Chicago Public Schools. He is the author and editor of more than 300 publications on literacy education. His research emphasizes the improvement of reading achievement, teaching reading with challenging text, and reading-writing relationships. He is past president of the International Literacy Association. He served as a member of the advisory board of the National Institute for Literacy under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And he helped lead the National Reading Panel, convening at the request of Congress to evaluate research on the teaching of reading, a major influence on reading education. And lastly, but not leastly, he was inducted to the Reading Hall of Fame in 2007 and is a former first grade teacher. And it's, again, my absolute pleasure to turn over to Dr. Shanahan. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And with that, I'm going to share my screen with you all, I hope. I do this right, and I think I am. Here we go. And then I need a PowerPoint so you can see what I'm talking about, and then we can get into this. It's a negative title, but we've been teaching kids, trying to teach at their instructional levels for a very long time. And I think that's a mistake. And we're going to get into all the reasons for that and so on. Let me just start putting this talk into some kind of context. Reading is a complex skill or a complex set of abilities that need all the different abilities that are part of reading require some kind of explicit instructional support. And so there are a whole raft of skills and abilities that go into reading words, decoding, recognizing words that don't, follow regular spelling patterns like of and those kinds of things. Having the phonemic awareness to be able to learn to decode. So all of that, those kinds of things over there. Then there, kids have to, it isn't enough that they just be able to read those words. They have to be able to read text fluently, which is kind of a mashup of both decoding and comprehension, because you use both sets of skills to be able to translate from print into language. Third area, reading comprehension. Kids have to learn how to use their language abilities, use their reasoning abilities, use their knowledge of the world to be able to think about the ideas and understand the ideas that are expressed in text. And finally, there are the the ability to write, which is very connected to reading and pulls in spelling and those kinds of things. Today, my focus is almost entirely going to be on reading comprehension. It is absolutely crucial that we pay attention to each of these areas, and so I'm not ignoring those other areas. Obviously we have to pay attention to all of them, but for the next hour or maybe a little less, we're going to be focused specifically on comprehension. Now, there's been a shift over the past decade or so to put more attention or put some attention on text complexity, putting kids in harder text. You hear terms like productive struggle and all that kind of thing. By the time kids leave high school, they should be able to read well enough to succeed in higher education or the workplace or the military. Those seem to be the major directions that kids go. And what the studies are showing us is around half, in fact, a bit more than half the kids in that are graduating from our high school. So these are the kids we're succeeding with. About roughly half of those, a little less than half, are actually able to read say a freshman college English textbook, or can pass the test to get into the military, or can actually get a job that would pay them enough that they could live on, and to be able, well, they can get those jobs, they just can't hold them. Same thing that happens to a lot of the kids to go off to college. What's the problem we're having is kids are leaving school not able to read texts that are as demanding as those that are required to participate fully in this society. Unfortunately, most teachers in the United States teach reading using below grade level text with many of their students. And so, the notion of, well, if they can read the fourth grade text in fourth grade and fifth grade and so on, if we can do that and walk the kids up those stair steps, by the time they leave high school, they should be able to read well enough to take advantage of this society. But if, say, you're in fourth grade and the teacher has you in a second grade book, when are you going to get to read the fourth grade book? And of course, it'll be sixth grade if everything goes well. And then, well, when do you deal with sixth grade? You're eventually going to get to the point where kids are leaving high school with a seventh, eighth, ninth grade reading level, which might sound terrific, but it means get in the back of the bus. Things aren't going to go well. Why do we teach so many kids with grade level text, under grade level text? Well, due to an untested theory. So, this notion of we're here because we're interested in evidence-based teaching, not any evidence on this. This was a theory that they came up with in the 1940s that claimed if you taught kids at their reading levels rather than their grade levels, you would raise reading achievement. You would optimize how much kids could learn. And so if you look at a good deal of comprehension instruction in the schools, it's kids at these supposedly reading level texts, these relatively easy texts, with a focus on practicing answering certain kinds of questions or applying certain kinds of strategies. And that system isn't really paying off for many of our kids. Now, I'm not saying kids aren't learning. Our kids are learning to read. There's no question. The vast majority of our kids, the statistics that you hear in the media and so on are not talking about whether kids can read or not. It's, for kids who aren't, damaged cognitively or damaged in terms of sensory terms, it's something like 99 point something percent of our kids are learning to read. The question is, are our kids learning to read well enough to allow them to do the kinds of things that they need to do and to have the kind of full lives they can have? And the answer to that is no. What we do works, it just doesn't work well enough. In fact, it holds kids back. And so I'm going to suggest that we think of reading maybe a little differently than we have in the past. Reading comprehension certainly is not the ability to answer certain kinds of text questions. The notion of, oh, we're going to have kids read passages and try to answer questions like on our state test or questions that match up with our state standards. Really, that doesn't work. I mean, the reading practice is fine, but you're not actually teaching kids how to answer those kinds of questions. Reading is the ability to make sense of the ideas expressed in text. It's the ability to negotiate the linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances of a text. Every text is an attempt by an author to communicate with an audience, and they build various kinds of affordances or supports into a text to try to communicate those ideas effectively. Now, sometimes they intentionally try to put barriers to comprehension, and there are reasons for that. But in a lot of cases, what's going on is the affordances that they've put into the text become barriers for at least some readers. Maybe the simplest example of this is vocabulary. An author might have terrific diction. They might be able to use exactly the right word that communicates exactly the right idea with the nuances and everything. And that can be terrific as long as your reader knows the meaning of the word. If they don't know the meaning of the word, your affordance just became a barrier. And so what we want our readers to be able to do is read text, recognizing the affordances and taking advantage of them, or recognizing I'm not getting this. This is some kind of a barrier to me. I've got to surmount this barrier. And teaching kids to read means teaching them to do those kinds of things. It's a little different concept. No, this doesn't. Lynn can be mad at me, but this page is not from the research. This is from my own observations, and I've been doing this for more than 50 years, almost 55 years now. So I think I'm pretty accurate on it, but this is not from some research study. What happens in most classrooms when it turns out that whatever the textbook is or set of readers are that the kids are supposed to read turn out to be hard and the kids are going to struggle with them? And I believe one of some combination of these four things tend to happen. One is the instructional level idea. We're going to move kids to easier text. You have to find text at kids' levels. I'm just going to set that one aside because we're coming back to it. Another one is this text is hard for my kids. I'll read it to them. They'll get the information, but they're not going to learn to read from that. Another one, especially in the upper grades, is the kids are going to struggle with this textbook, so I'll tell them what it says. I can lecture on this. I can give them, handouts on this. We can watch a video on this, and the kids will learn whatever it was content-wise that they were supposed to learn, but they won't necessarily be able to read it. And of course, there's also just you ignore the problem. You put the kid in the text. They can't answer the questions. If they can't do the task, kind of their problem. Too bad for them. I think it should be obvious that those steps might solve a problem. My kids can't read this book right now. I'm going to get them the information. But none of these are a good way to teach kids to read, if that's the point. And that's why I think we're here today. So bad choices, understandable choices, but not so wonderful for the kids. So why do we teach with such easy text? Well, in the 19th century, the emphasis in education was on trying to attract students to schools. It wasn't compulsory. You didn't have to go. And the notion, there were some arguments over it, but it evolved into if you had easy enough lessons, the kids would show up. And one of the steps in doing that, they divided schools into grade levels so that kids would be working with their age level peers, and you could put easier or harder demands on them. Textbooks got matched to those grade levels, and they frankly, they thought they'd solved the problem. But by the end of the 19th century, it was becoming apparent to everybody that just because you were in third grade didn't mean your reading abilities were equal to the other third graders. In other words, there was a lot of variation in the kids' abilities. Classrooms could be very large, like 60 and 70 kids in a class and more in some cases. And so the notion was we had to find a way that teachers could differentiate their teaching so that they could meet the kids' needs. And what that led to is from about 1915 through about the mid 1940s, there was really a nationwide search in school districts and among the reading scholars to try to come up with a system for matching kids to the curriculum, to the text that they needed to read. And there were all kinds of plans for this, including an Albany plan coming out of New York that might be of interest to some of you. But the one that caught on, the one that really seemed to capture teachers' understanding and college professors' understanding, was the one that Emmett Betts put forward. Betts believed that students had three reading levels. They had an independent reading level, which would allow them to handle certain level of text that they could read successfully on their own. There was an instructional level, texts a bit harder, but those texts with a little bit of teaching support, the kids would be able to make sense of them and learn to read. And frustration level text that you had to avoid at pretty much all costs, because even if you had a good teacher working with the kids with a text like that, it was presumed they wouldn't make learning progress, they wouldn't comprehend. And so obviously the one that teachers were to focus on was the instructional level. Now, Betts believed that for reading instruction to be successful, reading lessons had to result in comprehension. And a lot of there's no real evidence of that, but it's such a strongly held opinion by such a large percentage of educators, and it's been believed by so many people for so long. I'm going to say let's accept that. I think it's a reasonable theory or a reasonable hypothesis that by the end of the reading lesson, we want the boys and girls to be able to comprehend whatever text we're working with. That should be part of the payoff the kids get. The way that Betts and other educators argued we should get there was by putting kids in text that they would be able to comprehend with very little support and very little effort. Students should be able to overcome those barriers I was talking about with minimal support. Now, according to Betts, the instructional level meant that if I had a youngster read the text aloud to me, the child would be able to read 95 to 98% of the words accurately. And so if you were, doing an informal reading inventory, which is what he recommended, you would know the instructional level, and the comprehension would be 75 to 89%. And so if I were going to ask questions about this text, the kids would be able to answer 89% of the questions. I got to say to you folks, a youngster who's recognizing 95 to 98% of the words and can comprehend it with almost 90%, I think I would declare victory and go home. That's really a fairly high level of reading. And remember, that's on a cold read with no instruction. And so it's a very relatively easy standard. Now, since Betts came up with that and published that in 1946, there have been other proposals. Everyone buys the basic theory that there's an instructional level, but people have adjusted it. So, for example, Edward Gickling suggested that it wasn't 95 to 98% accuracy. It had to be 93 to 97% accuracy. And he was, you don't use an IRI, you use curriculum-based measures. So you're going to be timing this. Marie Clay, she argued for 90% accuracy for the first graders that were going to be taught in reading recovery. So it's going to be one-on-one instruction. And Faunis and Pinnell took that and has really carried that up the grade levels. In all of those cases, these all differ to a very small extent in terms of their criteria. In all cases, the argument is that if you match kids to the books appropriately, the kids will learn more. And that's really what the bottom line is. Another thing that they all share in common, and none of them have research evidence supporting the idea. And so this is really purely a set of beliefs, and I'll show you where it comes from and so on in a moment. Actually right here. Emmett Betts publishes his textbook in 1946, and he explains that the data that those criteria are based upon came out of a doctoral dissertation done under his supervision, Kilgallen's dissertation here that's listed here. And the way it sounds when you read the book, and given what he's claiming the instructional level does, is it sounds like the evidence he's talking about well, to me, the way it sounded was they must have placed some kids at their instructional level and some kids at their frustration level, and then taught the two groups to see what would happen. But that isn't at all what they did. What Kilgallen did is he tested 41 fourth graders, gave them an IRI, saw what their level of comprehension was, like you would on a test like that, saw what their level of accuracy on the test like that. And what he looked for was what level of accuracy matched up with being able to comprehend 70% of the passage. And so the kids who were getting 70% of the questions right in or higher in comprehension were recognizing about 95% of the words. It was really a study of how fluently do you have to read to get a level of comprehension. That's what the study was. There was no teaching in it. The study was done once the kids were tested. I don't think that's an adequate test of this notion of you got to teach kids at these levels. But there are people who disagree with me on that. There have been a number of studies that followed Kilgallen where people tried to do the same thing, and they believe that Kilgallen got it wrong, that the numbers aren't quite right, but they're buying in. And so I'm going to share those with you anyway, even though I don't believe in it, but I just want to show you how it goes on its own terms. Powell did a number of studies through the 1960s and 1970s. He bought into the theory that Kilgallen and Betts were following, that the whole issue was just matching up fluency and comprehension. But he didn't test a small group of fourth graders. He tested much larger groups of kids, first grade through eighth grade, so a much larger, more diverse sample. And what he was finding was, first of all, there wasn't a single instructional level, that the way to match kids to text varied by grade level. So we should all be doing this differently. And he was finding that some of the grade levels, accuracy levels in the mid 80s was what predicted the level of comprehension they were shooting for. And frankly, you could really take the kids' comprehension down into the 50% and below 50%. He was treated as a kook, even though he had more data and better data. Nobody wanted to believe that, one, there was more than one reading level, and two, that kids could learn from harder text. Dunkeld was one of his students, and he did a very different kind of study. He went out and tested a bunch of second graders at the beginning of a school year with an informal reading inventory, and he found out what the kids' reading levels were. Didn't tell the teachers. He tested the kids, determined their reading levels, and then monitored the levels at which the teachers taught the boys and girls. And so little Jimmy, maybe on Dunkeld's test, came out that he was instructional at a first grade level. Maybe Mrs. Jones put little Jimmy in a second grade book, so he'd be in a frustration level book. Maybe another little kid tested out at second grade level, and he was in a second grade level book. So you could see all these patterns. And then what he did is at the end of the year, they came back and tested the kids. And what they were interested in is which placements led to the greatest amount of learning for these second graders. And what he found is when the kids were placed at about 85% in accuracy and less than 50% in reading comprehension, those were the kids who made the biggest learning gains during the year. In other words, placing the kids at frustration level gave the biggest payoff. Study that's virtually never cited. Jorgensen did a similar study later on with third, fourth, and fifth graders and found absolutely no difference in learning whether the kids were placed at their frustration or their instructional levels. McNamara study with middle school kids found, this wasn't a study of teaching reading, found the kids learned more content from the text that were hard for them, that would have been at frustration level. It's not until the year 2000 that Alyssa Morgan and her colleagues do the first true experiment on this to test to see if this idea that we've been doing since the 1940s actually works. And what she did is she took a bunch of second graders, she tested them again with an informal reading inventory, found their reading levels, and then randomly assign them to different treatment groups. One group got placed at their instructional levels. They did work at it. So if you were reading at a second grade level, you were going to be in a second grade book by Betts criteria. Then another group of the kids, they were gonna, if they read at a second grade level, they were gonna be placed in a text 2 grade levels above their reading level. So frustration level text. And the third group, if they were reading at a second grade level, they'd be put 4 grade levels above their reading level. So wow, really frustration level text. They teach these kids for several months, and at the end of the time, they test them. And what they found is that the group who was taught at their reading level made the smallest gain. All the groups made learning gains, but they made the smallest learning gains of all. Their opportunity to learn was so small that there just wasn't much to learn. Those kids who had been taught 2 grade levels above their reading level, they made almost a year's more learning progress than the other kids. And those kids who were 4 grade levels above, they didn't do as well as that 2 grade level group. They certainly did better than the group that was at the instructional level. Essentially, what the study found is placing kids at their instructional level wasn't accelerating or optimizing learning. It was actually putting a limitation on how much kids could learn. It was holding them back, not moving them forward. Brown and her colleagues come back later and do a replication of that study with third graders and found the same thing. O'Connor, these are a couple of studies. This O'Connor 2002 and 2010. The 2002 one is cited a lot, even though it's really got a serious problems with it. The 2010 one, not so much, even though published by the same researchers in the same journal and so on. The first one, what they did is they took a group of kids who had IEPs. So these are all children identified as having learning disabilities. They were in third, fourth, and fifth grade. They're going to get one-on-one tutoring. They're going to be taught something you'll never believe: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. That's going to be what their curriculum. And what the differences are going to be, she again puts these kids in 3 groups. One group isn't going to get tutored. They're just going to do their regular classroom work, and we'll see what happens. And this is a random assignment. A second group is going to do all the kinds of stuff I said, and they're going to do that with text at their reading level. So if they were tested, you're at 4th grade, you tested out, it said you were reading at a beginning 2nd grade level, that's what your textbook's going to be. The third group is going to be they're going to be placed in text at their grade level. So that same kid, 5th grader, is going to be put in the second. No, he's not going to be put in 2nd grade book. He's going to be put in the 5th grade book. Yeah, but he reads at a 2nd grade level. Yeah, but he's a 5th grader. He's going to be in the 5th grade book. They do this for some length of time. And unlike any of the other studies that I've told you about, this one at the end of it concludes that there was a small benefit, a real, statistically significant benefit. It wasn't huge, but there was a real learning benefit for the kids who were in the instructional level group. Now, both of the groups who received instruction did better than the control group, which is good. But the one that made the biggest gains in word reading and decoding were the ones placed at their instructional level. There were no differences in comprehension or any of that, but there were in those important basic skills, those foundational skills. And O'Connor goes through these data pretty carefully. Oh, well, let me just, I need to add something, or Marilyn Adams and other people will be mad at me. They follow this study. It's a nicely designed study, but then they decide about halfway into, after several weeks of instruction, if the kids in the instructional groups aren't succeeding, they don't seem to be doing well, they swap them. They move them to the other group and make it just a total hash of this. So Marilyn Adams would say, Tim Shanahan shouldn't be telling you about this study. There's no way to know whether the kids really did better. And she's not wrong about that. But if I don't tell you about this study, when you read somebody saying Tim Shanahan's an idiot on this, we have this O'Connor study that shows that at least for kids with learning disabilities, this helps. But I'm going to stay with how O'Connor talks about this because she goes into it and she really looks at her data carefully. And she concludes that it was true that the kids who ended up at their instructional level being taught at that did do better, but it wasn't everybody. It was only the bottom half of the distribution. The lowest readers, this was true for. It wasn't true for the other kids in the sample. And she tells you that the best readers in the study were reading at a beginning second grade level. So think about that, there are some kids reading at second grade level, but most of the kids in this study are reading at first grade level, or maybe even lower than that, right? So these are very low readers. And so it's not true for the kids who are reading more like second grade level, but it was true for those really beginning readers. So that's one take on it. But let's talk about this 2010 study. O'Connor comes back later and she says there was something about the first study that bothered her. And she's not bothered by how they screwed up the sampling, but she's bothered by the fact that I don't remember if they audio taped the kids or videotaped the instruction. I think it was audio taped. But what they did is she found that when the kids would make an oral reading mistake, the different tutors would respond differently. So maybe Lynn would have the kids sound it out. Maybe I would just tell the kids the words. Maybe you, would tell the kid to skip it, and on and on and on. And she worried that might be affecting the outcomes, that maybe we weren't really seeing a difference of text, but we were seeing a difference in instruction. And so what she does in this study is she does a lot of the same things that she did before, but she doesn't foul the sample by moving the kids around. But this time she trains all the tutors to respond in a standard way so that goes away as a confound. And they do this study. And what she found was it made absolutely no difference whether the kids were placed at their instructional level or at their grade level. They made the same level of gain. That we were holding these kids back, putting them, isolating them from the other kids, segregating them from the other kids, putting them in lower language materials, putting them in content that wouldn't match their maturity level as well. And it wasn't making any learning difference for the boys and girls. Kuhn did a study first study with second graders and then later with third graders. The instruction that they gave, one group got guided reading and the kids were at their levels. The other group got fluency-oriented reading instruction. And so the kids are working with, a lot of them are working with frustration level text. At the end of the year, the kids in the 4E group, the ones who'd been taught with grade level text, way outdistanced the other kids, so much so that the school district asked if they could carry the study on for a second year. So they went into third grade and the kids extended their gains. The guided reading approach to it, where they were placing everybody at their level, was actually holding the kids back rather than accelerating them forward. Almost done with the studies, guys, but this is pretty much every study that's been done on this. Homan and her colleagues, they taught sixth graders either with instructional level text or text a year above that and found no advantage to the instructional level text. Lupo working with ninth graders, she, again, it was either grade level text or easier texts that were meant to match the kids' reading levels. The kids expressed a preference for working with the grade level text with support over that. What she found was that the instructional level text was giving these kids no learning advantage, with the exception of the lowest multilingual readers, the lowest of the English learners, newcomers and such, didn't have enough English language to benefit from the harder text. And so they actually did do a little bit better. What I'm telling you from all of those studies is that none of them show any real learning advantage to placing students at their instructional levels. They get one of two findings. They either find it makes no difference, so you're wasting a lot of time and you're holding kids back from experiencing that harder text, or it actually they lose. They don't do as well in reading. They don't get as high of achievement. The advantage goes to the challenging text, not the simple text. And I think one of the things that is obvious in those studies where they actually tried to teach the kids to read the harder text and didn't just put them in it, is where the learning advantages came in rather than it's no better or no worse than, it turns out to actually be more effective. I'm running out of time fast. Um, all these studies were conducted in grade 2 through high school. There are no beginning reader studies. I suspect that the need to develop basic decoding abilities is better served with relatively easier text in kindergarten and first grade. I think what's wrong is we've been taking this instructional level idea that's terrific for a very brief time in kids' learning, and we've exploded it across the entire gradient of learning, which makes no sense. Clearly, so many of these studies were done at second grade that it's clear you don't have to have all your decoding skills there, but you have to have the basics of it. You'd have to have what I would consider what you'd expect, say, an average reading first grader to have by the end of the year. That level, well, not all my second graders have that. I get it. And I'd be a lot more careful about putting a child like that into a harder text than I would. This kid is, pretty much can read like an average first grader by close to the end of the year. He can read like a first grade level. That's sufficient decoding apparently to allow the kids to still make gains from, and it doesn't mean they don't still need phonics and so on. Remember, I said there are all those different parts that still have to be taught. This is just the comprehension part. Um, Instead of avoiding difficulty, we need to teach readers how to surmount it. Let me just share a quick anecdote, and then I want to go into the why this doesn't work. Um, I was giving some version of this talk a while back in the state of Ohio at an IDA, an International Dyslexia Conference. And this was, I believe, a state level conference or a regional one. And because of that, it's not just teachers who attend that. A lot of parents, of course, in special education come, but also because there were kids like high school kids who were on kids with dyslexia who were on the honor roll or who were being admitted to selective colleges and so on. They were giving them awards and stuff. So unlike my typical audience, I had a number of high school students in my audience. And I talked about this, and when I went through those studies that were saying that putting these kids in lower books wasn't advantaging them, and therefore there wasn't any point to doing that, I got cheers in the audience. Cheers. Now, that isn't typical in my talks that I get cheered, so I was quite pleased. But I talked to these kids later, and what they said is what that meant to them is they didn't have to be put in the stupid books anymore, is the way they put it. Um, I think in a way you need to start thinking about when you put kids in below grade level books, it's kind of a soft retention policy. You're flunking the kid, but we're not going to tell anybody. And we're not going to put in all the protections that we have when it does come to things like retention. Okay, that story aside. Why doesn't it work? Well, there are three things that have to be in place for this theory of instructional level to pay off. The first one is your assessments. Those IRIs or running records or curriculum-based assessments have to provide fairly accurate estimates of students' reading levels. If they don't do that, if it says, if this kid reads at a second grade level and it says he reads at a third grade level, you're going to put the youngster in a book that's way too hard according to the theory. Or if you'll put them in first grade level, way too hard. So we need fairly accurate testing procedures. The second thing is the readability or leveling system has to be fairly accurate as well. Again, if I'm going to put this youngster in a fourth grade book, and it turns out that this fourth grade book is at a second grade level, then, I'm not going to be giving this kid this optimum instruction. And the third thing that has to be in place is I'm going to, obviously I'm going to be teaching multiple groups of kids at multiple levels of text, which means that my small group instruction is going to have to be so powerful that it's going to offset the loss of time. If I'm teaching whole class, let's say I could have an hour-long lesson with everybody. If I'm going to break it into 3 or 4 groups, well, everyone's going to get 15 minutes or 20 minutes. that's a big reduction in amount of instruction they're going to get. So it's got to be fairly powerful. But when we look at the actual studies of all these things and all the statistics on the assessments, first of all, the assessments all have standard errors of measurement that are larger than those 95 to 98 and 93 and 97. In other words, it's very common, highly common. You should expect kids to be often placed 1 or 2 grade levels off of whatever you thought you were aiming for. And the leveling systems, things like Lexiles or the Faunus and Pinnell levels, uh, those aren't those uh, gradients are fine if you just want to know which book is harder than another book. They do a reasonably good job of that. They can be quite useful. But what they don't do is they don't give you a system for putting kids in text that leads to them learning more. Something like Lexiles, it's a predictive system. The whole point is to predict how well somebody is going to comprehend a particular text. Oh, this text will be harder. This one will be somewhat easier. They try to predict comprehension. They don't try to predict learning. Learning in the sense of if you place the kids in this text, will they learn more than if you place them in that text? They don't even make those claims. They don't make those claims. They don't overstate what their things are. And then third, small group instruction is more powerful than whole class instruction. But small group teaching usually accompanies reductions in the amount of teaching, which takes away that advantage. And so, oh, look, in these 15 minutes, I taught the kids a ton. But the fact that he's only going to get 15 minutes today means that the whole class kids do as well. And then there's one other really hurtful thing, and I know you all teach in different situations and so on, but one of the things the studies show is that if you're a minority, and I'm going to say here, minority can be a racial minority, it can be a linguistic minority, it can be an economic minority, it can be the kids who only have a single parent, that minority, the studies show that those kids learn much less in this system. They're almost always placed in the bottom group. They tend to get segregated there. We resegregate the schools with a lot of this. And kids are making substantially less gains than they can when they're taught with texts that are more appropriately leveled than at their supposed instructional level. So those of you who are really concerned about social justice and making the system more equal really need to worry about this a lot. So teaching with grade level text expands opportunity to learn. I mean, if you think of it like this, if we could really do this accurately, here's the text level that I'm going to place kids in because it's their instructional level, and it's not that hard for them. I placed them, these are how the kids are performing, and there's some words the kids don't know, and they're not going to be able to answer all the questions. There's a little bit there for them to learn. But if I put those kids at grade level, they're going to be a number of kids who it isn't going to look like that. It's going to look like that. That space is opportunity to learn. Gee, here this kid only missed 3 words in the whole thing. Here he missed 10 words. That's more opportunity. But opportunity isn't the same as learning. There's greater possibility to learn from grade level material. That's where instruction has to come in. And that's where we need to change how we think about differentiation. That's how where we need to change how we will support kids' learning. When teachers teach reading with text at students' instructional levels, the amount that students can learn is limited. The amount of teaching that is needed will be limited as well. You don't have to do very much. In fact, one of the things that's come in a lot of the studies, if you have kids read a text once, they're going to make a number, cold read, they're going to make a number of decoding errors. The accuracy won't be perfect. If you don't give them any instruction or guidance, and you just ask them immediately when they finish to read the text again, the number of errors they make tends to go down by about 50%. So if they made 15 errors the first time, they make 7 or 8 the second. One of the weird things, they don't necessarily make the same errors. They change a bit. It's less reliable than you'd think. And therefore, we're going to place I'm going to avoid this text because the kid is only going to be able to, recognize 85% of the words. But what if I just did some fluency practice first and then asked him to read it? Well, now he's at the instructional level in that text. Now we can read it in the 90%. With more challenging text, there's a greater opportunity to learn since there's more linguistic and conceptual misunderstandings that the texts are going to pose. And so there's more opportunity for teachers to teach things. So let's this list of studies, and I'm not going to get into these. Essentially, what these studies do is intentionally place kids in frustration level texts, and they're not going to measure how well the kids learn and what happens to their reading achievement. But what they do in these studies is they put kids in texts that they know are frustration level, and they add some kind of a scaffold. So maybe I'm going to ask the youngster, I want him to read it aloud to me once first before we take on the text. Or maybe I'm going to pre-teach some vocabulary or, those kinds of things. And what every one of these studies finds is you can easily transform what we've called frustration level text into instructional level text just by our scaffolding. And so instead of thinking of a reading level being the match of the kids to the text, you need to think of it as the match of the kids to the text with teacher guidance, support, explanation, scaffold, right? All that kind of stuff, because that changes the equation. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we can do this, and I have how many minutes? I went out of many. This one I'll just tell you about. I've mentioned it a couple times. A lot of times in classrooms, teachers work on fluency, but they'll do it something like this. The teacher might do like a directed reading activity or a guided reading activity. In other words, the kids and the teacher are going to read a text together. They're going to, this could be small group or whole class, but the kids are going to read it with the teacher. They're going to answer questions. They'll talk about it. Maybe the teacher will have them practice a strategy or whatever, that kind of thing. And then when they're done with that, the teacher might have them pair up and do paired reading, some, fluency practice, or maybe they'll do, reading while listening with this text that they just read. But I've got some kids in my class who are reading far below level, and I believe that one of the reasons for that is they're having trouble. Maybe they know their basic decoding, but in a fourth grade book, they can't read the words well enough or fast enough, and therefore they struggle and they're slower than the other kids. And what can I do? And what I'm going to suggest you do in a case like that is you turn the practice on its head. You're still going to do a directed reading activity where the kids and the teacher are going to read it for comprehension. But instead of doing fluency practice later, why don't you start, at least with those kids, with fluency practice? Do that first. Cut the distance between the kid and the book for those kids who are struggling with the fluency. Well, how do you do? Well, it could be this youngster gets pull-out instruction. Maybe the pull-out teacher could, a day or two before you get to this in your class, could have those kids practice fluency with that text so that when they're seeing it with all the other kids, they've already done it. Maybe this is one where mom or dad will help you. Maybe, you're all under such different circumstances, but the notion of getting the fluency practice done first makes some kind of sense. I want to jump to vocabulary. Vocabulary is another one where there are a number of studies showing that pre-teaching the words either, these are words I don't think the kids can read. So Matthew Burns, a special educator, he and his colleagues go in and teach some of these words as sight words, get the kids to learn these words, and guess what? Their ability to handle the text that they've drawn these words from goes up. A lot of the studies are about familiarizing the kids with the meanings of the words before they read it. You do that, and the text isn't as frustrating. The text, moves up to being an easier text where the kids are learning from it. And of course, they're already learning from it with that preparation. Unfortunately, when I look at a lot of materials, whether we're talking commercial materials or whether we're talking some of those materials that teachers are selling to each other, everyone's pretty big on the idea of let's identify the words here the kids aren't going to know and let's pre-teach it or pre-familiarize them. And that's cool. But I swiped this out of a fourth grade textbook, and it doesn't matter whose textbook, it's just a good example, I think. I look at this and I bet you can all guess a word that's going to be pre-taught in that passage. And I can show you right away, so we're not fooling around. That drives me crazy because the word photosynthesis in this science text is defined. The author, that's an affordance. The author is going to give you a scientific definition of this science term. And the textbook tells the teacher to pre-teach it. If the point of the text is to explain photosynthesis and the teacher's going to tell them what photosynthesis is before they read it, why read it? What's the point? And so it's good to pre-teach words. That's a way to make a hard text easier, but do not pre-teach words that the author's going to teach. Do not pre-teach words that context or morphology would allow the kids to get. Those words should become comprehension questions. And so if I think the kids can figure out glaciers here, I don't want to pre-teach that. I'm going to have the kids read this, and when they're done, I'm going to ask them what a glacier is. And if they don't know, we're going to go back to the text and we're going to figure it out. Gee, they melt. What melt? You know, that sounds like ice, snow, or something like that. And they raise sea level. Gee, they melt and that raises sea level. They must be big. I want kids to have to do that kind of thing. Pre-teaching a word like that makes the text easier, but it avoids teaching the kids how to read. That's crazy. I still can do another. I want to get out of the words. Another example of what I'm talking about, and I just came across this one yesterday, so I stuck this in. Sentences matter. One of the reasons why kids get lost is they have trouble reading a sentence. And I think they'll have trouble with this one. Gamers have had enough of reality. They are abandoning it in droves. A few hours here, an entire weekend there, sometimes every spare minute of every day for stretches at a time in favor of simulated environments and online games. The author here has done something that's very cool. It's made it an interesting sentence, but it makes it really hard to understand. Essentially, trying to show you that there are a lot of people who want to live in a virtual world and they find that entertaining. Author's going to give you many examples of that. The claim is they are abandoning reality in droves in favor of simulated environments. The way you have to read that sentence to understand it is you have to skip the whole middle part and then go back and get it. Who's teaching kids to do that? Who is reading the text ahead of time and saying, wow, I think that sentence is going to screw them up. I want to make sure I ask a question about that so that if it is overwhelming them, got an airplane coming over, a helicopter coming over me. And so we want to teach kids to do this kind of thing. Here's one. This is out of a fifth grade text. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. It's a 25-word sentence, has 5 commas, has parentheses and some other things that make this hard. Are there any verbs in this sentence? Are any of you finding any verbs? And in fact, there is one. What is that? The 23rd word in the sentence. And so very different than oral language. You know, we want kids to bring their language to reading. That's true, but text is going to present them with more complex forms of language, and we have to teach that. And research really supports that kind of teaching. And so what we need to do with a sentence like this is we need to show kids how it works. You can see the reason the verb's so hard to find in this sentence. The blue part is the subject. And this is typical now of science writing, and it's getting more and more typical of other kinds of informational text. There are a ton of words in that subject that you have to read and make sense of long before you get to the verb. And we tend to make sense of the sentences from the verb out. And so a lot of kids, they don't get that far. They're not going to read all the way to made. They're going to lose the thread of this 4 or 5 words in, and they're probably going to skip, and they might skip the next couple of sentences. And so now they're not going to comprehend it. And so I'd break it down. Another possibility, if they can't tell me what the IAU did, is I might take them back to that sentence and let's read it and read it again. Who was it about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did getting them to work through the sentence's meaning. And we can do a bunch of things like that. Let me just show you one more and I will shut up, I promise. Cohesion. One of the things I really want to stress here, especially given Lynn's credentials when she introduced me, clearly she's representing a school that's very interested in language and language-based disabilities. And as I said, oral language is one thing, and written language depends on that, but it's different. It's more complex and more extensive and so on. And one of the things that makes it hard is trying to keep track of the connections across a text. And so, for example, the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it. And the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Now, those sentences are pretty much identical, but one of them is markedly easier than the other one. That second sentence, the way I'm linking the ideas is I'm going to repeat the word. I'll say penguin twice. In the first one, I'm going to use a pronoun. In another one, I might choose to use a synonym. And of course, in another situation, I might have another animal in here someplace. So now when you say its prey, gee, are we talking now about the walrus or are we talking about the penguin? It gets more and more complicated. And the farther the distance is between them. What we need to do to teach kids to read harder text is we need to first read the text ahead of time, identify potential barriers to understanding. What is it that you think will trip kids up? Gee, the author expects them to know this idea. They don't know it. The author is using these words. I don't think that the kids are going to be able to figure them out. And those are important words because they block comprehension. This, sentence is really complicated. I don't think the kids will get it. I don't think the kids are going to recognize that before it eats it, who it is there. I'm going to question them on that. There are cases where you might want to head off a problem, but more often than not, I want the kids to try to read that hard text. I want them to make the mistakes. And I want you to take them back. The point here isn't to make them feel bad or to make this hard for them. The point is to start to show them how to solve a text like this. What do you do when you're reading it and it isn't making sense? You're not understanding and not just solving the problem immediately, which allows the kids to understand the text. We're going to do that, right? We're going to honor that theory. But we're going to make sure that they're learning how to do this in future texts so that when they're taking on hard text, they can actually comprehend them. Instead of avoiding difficulty, instead of holding kids back, instead of resegregating classrooms, instead of this soft retention policy, we need, for most kids, to place them in the grade level text. And the way you differentiate isn't by teaching level, we're going to teach kids this language and other kids this language. We're going to teach them the same language, but we might intensify the instruction with one kid or one group or another. And I think I'm out of time and I apologize for using it all, but there's a lot of stuff to say and you wouldn't believe I probably have 40 more slides here that I could have taken you through. Let me give the screen back to our host, if I may, and I just did.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanahan. That was fascinating. So I know we're out of time. We have several questions in the chat. Can I just share a couple with you if you have a few moments? Because I'm looking for some of the themes. And you really spoke to this just a moment ago, but there were several questions about dyslexic students who are several years below grade level. But you're saying you don't read aloud. Read aloud isn't good. So how do I get these students to access the text?
Well, read aloud is good if the point is to share the information. There are situations where I don't have time to teach him to read the science book, but we've recorded it for him so he can get the information out of the science book that will allow him at least to get the same content. But what if you actually want him to be able to read the science book? What if that's part of the instructional case? And a lot of times that
Right.
is. And
Sure.
so in the one case, reading it or having them listen to a recording is absolutely fine. In the other case, it's a lousy way to go because it won't teach them to read. All it'll do is take away the need to read in that case. You're avoiding what you really don't want to avoid. You want to help the youngster. And one thing I would say about it, and this isn't just true for these dyslexic kids, it's true for any kids who struggle with this, including some kids who maybe you'd think, boy, they should do really well with this, and they're finding it really hard. We should tell kids what we're doing. They should understand in the past, you're in sixth grade. In the past, I would have put you in a third grade book. I'm going to put you in the sixth grade book with everybody else, but it's going to be hard, and I'm going to have to
Right.
help you and support you. But you can do this, and I'm not going to let you fail. They'll come with you, I promise.
I'm going to ask one last question because it came up a few times. And for all the others, I'm just going to let people know if you're unaware, Dr. Shanahan has a blog and he actually takes questions on there, correct? And answers.
Yeah. And Lynn, any questions we don't get to, why don't you send them to me, and I'll turn some of them into blogs.
Oh, that would be
Yeah.
amazing. That's so, thank you so much. So the other one that kept coming up was about readability levels and how do you sort of navigate that? And are there ones that you feel, I know you mentioned gradients earlier, but are there specific ones that you actually believe are reliable and valid?
Yeah, well, they all have some degree of reliability and validity. Probably the best of there are some scientific ones that are used more for research in terms of trying to identify what is that's making a text difficult. They don't do any better job of those much more onerous measures don't do any better job of placing kids at levels. Probably the best one that's available to teachers in terms of readability is Lexiles, and
Hmm.
it's the most known. It's got very large samples of kids that the data are based on, and so on. But again, you have to remember, as good as those are, they have a standard error of measurement. And
Hmm.
so practically, the way they do it, if let's say you send them a book to Lexile and they'll send it back to you and say, well, this is 750 Lexiles. What that means is they've gone through and taken all the 125 word passages in the book and fed it through their system. And they take the average. And
Hmm.
so that book that they're saying, oh, this is, fourth graders can read this, will have passages that range from first grade to eighth and ninth grade level right there in the same book. And
Right,
so
right.
it really is kind of, and again, the real key thing you all have to remember, Lexiles and all and let me just hit the F and P stuff, those levels. Those are that's a qualitative system where they've got 10 different variables, and each of those variables has all these different measures in them. And people are supposed to just sort of do this. Uh, Even Fountas and Pinnell complain that they're not sure that the ones coming out of different publishers are even right. It's a very complicated system. The couple of studies on it say, but it correlates. They can tell the difference between a G and a J. One is usually harder than the other one. They all of these do a reasonable job of telling you which is easier, which is harder. None of these do a job of telling you which books kids would learn to read better from. None of them.
Hmm.
And that's the key. And so if you're just looking for, gee, I'd like something that my, fourth graders could read on their own, they can do a pretty good, any of those can do a pretty good job for you. If you're looking for, I want my kids to do really well in reading and I want to put them at the right level for instruction, they can't do it. They don't even try to do it. They don't have any of those kinds of data. Could I
That's
add
really
one
interesting.
thing before
Please.
we close up? One of the reasons you heard me talking like crazy about this, and I'm very excited about it. As I was telling Lynn last week, I finished writing a book on this, which is going to Harvard Education Press, the university at Harvard University. And I think sometime next year that book should come out. And it goes through in detail, not only all the history of this and why it doesn't work and all the data on that, but it also, there's a chapter on beginning reading. What do we do with those first graders? And on more information on that, preparing kids with fluency and word teaching. Chapter on all this language stuff, chapter on motivation and so on. So I think you'll find it useful. I hope you will.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much for sharing. Looking forward to that coming out. And thank you for your offer. I will take the Q&As and email them to Dr. Shanahan for, so hopefully you can feature them on the blog. I will include a link to his blog when I send out the recording as well. Dr. Shanahan, it was just such an honor to host you. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Sorry we couldn't have done this face to face, everybody.
I know you are in New York, so right now. Oh no, you're in Vermont.
I'm just outside of New York. Have a really good school year, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Good luck to you.
Goodbye.